I sat down with Broadway's currently reigning Jane Seymour, Jasmine Forsberg, to help me break down her song Heart of Stone from Six the Musical. On the surface, Heart of Stone feels like a love song from Jane Seymour to Henry VIII. It's a bit of a change of pace for the show, which has ridiculed Henry VIII up to this point, but there's a subtle way in which Heart of Stone actually does diminish Henry VIII by shifting the center of gravity to Jane's love while subordinating Henry VIII to her love. And it all has to do with this chord progression, which has a few surprises up its sleeve.
Whoa, Howard! Whoa! Hold up! Oh my gosh, you're rocking my world! Wow, okay, awesome. Go off, Howard. Go off.
This is how Heart of Stone works. But first, if the song is celebrating Jane's love, then why is it called Heart of Stone, a phrase that is typically reserved for people who are not loving?
Don't love me, don't call me, don't need me, don't pay me. You've a heart of stone, Jamie.
Then there's Barty Crouch, Heart of Stone, sent his own son to Azkaban.
Take an eye for an eye. Turn your heart into stone.
This idea of a heart of stone even dates back to Shakespeare's Othello.
And perish and be damned. Tonight, for she shall not live. No, my heart is turned to stone. I strike it, and it hurts my hand.
Before Jane Seymour sings Heart of Stone, she acknowledges this original meaning in her dialogue.
You know, people say Henry was stone-hearted, uncaring.
But in an effort to differentiate herself from the other queens, who she says were full of fire, Jane casts herself as their opposite.
Instead, I stood by him like I was made of stone. I stood firm, no matter his flaws or his tempers, no matter my doubts or fears. I stayed there, by his side.
Which is also why Prudential Insurance has the Rock of Gibraltar as its logo, or why the married singing duo Ashford and Simpson describe their love as solid as a rock. And it's also why the stone manipulating people from the Earth Kingdom in Avatar are described as dependable.
Earth is the element of substance. The people of the Earth Kingdom are diverse and strong. They are persistent and enduring.
In fact, this comparison to the other elements of nature continues within the lyrics of the song Heart of Stone itself.
I mean, we go in the chorus, when the fire's burned, the wind has blown, the water's dried. All of those elements are ephemeral. They disappear, but stone stays. It lasts.
But there's another way in which the idea of a heart of stone actually works to convey the true meaning of the song. See, stone is denser and heavier than fire, air, and water, so it has more gravity. And on stage, we see that gravity embodied as Jane Seymour sings the entire song from center stage with no choreography.
My blocking is to stand on zero. I stand and I deliver a number. I mean, I get to stand, literally textbook definition, park and bark.
But Jane's stillness and simplicity is not just symbolic of her steadfastness and gravity, but also harkens back to the pop inspirations or queenspirations that Moss and Marlow based Jane's character on. Adele and Celine Dion, who are known for their big, planted, center stage vocal performances. Jane's stillness is felt even in the music that accompanies her.
What is so interesting about this music is that it is so simple. It's just chord, chord, chord.
You've got a good heart, but I know it changes.
A minimal striking of one chord per measure heard on just one instrument, the piano, and you'll notice this one note stays the same in all four chords, accentuating that feeling of standing firm, plain and simple.
Jane Seymour, plain Jane, her motto, historically speaking, her motto was bound to obey and serve. And so if she is serving the music, obeying that measure, obeying that just steady rhythm. That's what I think of when I think of stone. It's just steady, it's constant.
And even though the idea of obeying sounds subservient,
bound to obey and serve, isn't that your motto?
But the way Jane obeys and serves is entirely on her own terms. She has chosen this role, and in an interview with Vulture, Lucy Moss explains it like this.
The idea was about the strength of choosing to love someone and committing to someone, and that being an equally valid feminist experience.
See, there's two ways of thinking of love. One is that love is like a gift you give someone.
Last Christmas, I gave you my heart.
And so the recipient of the love then somehow owns that love and can do with the love as they please.
But the very next day, you gave it away.
In this model, the receiver of the love has all the power. Now, if you imagine yourself as the spouse of a king, it would be very easy to see that king being the receiver of your love and being someone who can do with that love as he pleases. He is the king, after all. But there's another way of viewing love, that love belongs not to the receiver, but to the giver. This type of love was explained in the film adaptation, where Charlie Kaufman, played by Nicolas Cage, recalls a time when he saw his brother Donald, also played by Nicolas Cage, talking to his high school crush, Sarah Marsh.
I was watching you at the library window. You were talking to Sarah Marsh. Oh, God, I was so in love with her. And she was being really sweet to you. I remember that. And then, when you walked away, she started making fun of you with Kim Kennedy.
Again, the recipient of the love, Sarah Marsh, seems to throw Donald's love away, but Donald remains unfazed by this.
I knew. I heard them. Well, how come you were so happy? I love Sarah, Charles. It was mine. That love. I owned it. Even Sarah didn't have the right to take it away.
The ownership of the love belonged to Donald, the giver, and not Sarah, the receiver, and her response to his gift of love made no difference to him because he owned the love, not her. In other words, he shifted the center of gravity of his love away from the recipient, Sarah, to the giver, himself. Similarly, though Jane knows that without her son,
Without my son, your love could disappear.
she also says,
I know it isn't fair, but I don't care, 'cause my love will still be here.
a perfect encapsulation of the shift from her being in his orbit to him being in hers. And in Heart of Stone, songwriters Moss and Marlow convey the same idea in the music. They shift the center of gravity in the song away from the recipient of love, Henry VIII, to its giver, Jane Seymour. But how and what does it mean for a song to even have a center of gravity? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what the next part of this video is about, and it's going to involve looking at the chords within Heart of Stone and how they portray Jane's love. And the most basic center of gravity for most pieces of music is what's called a key center that has many names: home chord, tonic chord, one chord. It's all referring to the same thing.
All right, guys, listen to the blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
If Marty McFly is telling you the song is in the key of B major,
Blues riff and B.
He's saying that B major is the song's home chord. It's tonic chord, which means it's based around the tonic note of B, and that the entire song is based on a hierarchy where B major sits at the top. It's literally known as the number one chord, so in a way, it's the king of chords. And you can spot this one chord by the way it either begins a section of music or ends it, or both, which is what we have with Heart of Stone, which begins its verse and ends its chorus with the same chord, the one chord.
You've got a good heart, my heart of stone.
And starting and ending with the one chord makes sense because this song is directed at Henry VIII, the you being addressed in the lyrics. And if that's the case, the second most important chord in this hierarchy is the 5 chord, and it achieves this status because of the way the 5 chord supports the 1 chord. It's a second in command, if you will.
Grab a friend, that's your second. Your lieutenant, when there's reckoning to be reckoned.
And this 5 chord is so dominant in this hierarchy that in music theory, it is even called the dominant chord because of the way it supports the 1 chord or tonic chord.
You don't understand. Listen. Trumpets in D, tonic and dominant. It goes with the harmony. Yes, yes, yes.
And this 5-1 relationship isn't just true in Mozart's music, it's also the reason Shave and a Haircut 2 Bits sounds complete only if you resolve this 5 chord back to the 1 chord. or why the ending of Mahler's Second Symphony that I talked about in my last video about Leonard Bernstein has an ending that feels so satisfying. Throughout musical history, the 5-to-1 progression is one of the most common ways to end musical phrases. In musical theory terms, this is the strongest ending or strongest cadence. It's so common that Hook Theory's database of over 50,000 songs even shows that statistically the 5 chord most often leads back to the 1 chord. In music theory, this is one of the basic building blocks of what's called functional harmony. In Heart of Stone, the chord progression of the chorus ends on a 5 chord, leading us to expect a resolution on the 1 chord. That would sound like this. But that's not what happens in the song. Instead, the 5 chord is followed by the 4 chord, which sounds like this. In other words, the 4 chord is somehow overshadowing the 1 chord's resolution, and you can even tell how badly it's going for that 1 chord because the only way that the 1 chord can regain control of the song is with this insistent 5 chord pounding away until the 1 chord, and by extension the king, is back in power. So in a way, the 4 chord represents an alternative to the king, a center of musical power outside of the 1 chord. And so in a way, this 4 chord represents the other center of power in this song, Jane Seymour and her incredibly enduring love. But what does it mean to center the music around the 4 chord? Well, let's look at some songs which center the 4 chord while barely ever going to the 1 chord. Teenage Dream by Katy Perry begins on the 1 chord, as we expect. But once the bass enters, the 1 chord never returns, and instead we get this chord progression over and over. And thanks to Hook Theory's piano playback option, I could play it for you here easily without getting into copyright trouble. A chord progression which, like the chorus in Heart of Stone, centers on returning to the 4 chord. Almost like the song is trying to avoid the 1 chord, which is what Owen Pallett pointed out in his Slate article analyzing Teenage Dream. And in it, he describes how the chord progression creates a feeling of suspension because the song never arrives at the 1 chord. And in Teenage Dream, this conveys a sense that Katy Perry longs to stay forever suspended in this timeless dreamlike state of being a teenager forever. It is an expression of a desire for this fantasy. The 4 chord essentially alternates with the 5 chord. Remember, the 5 chord is supposed to take us home. So this move from the 4 to the 5 suggests a movement towards greater resolution. We've gone from second bass to third bass, so to speak. And if the song went to the 1 chord, here's what it would sound like. But instead of going to home base, the progression goes back to the 4 chord. This lack of resolution to the 1 chord keeps us wanting more, like dangling a carrot in front of us, conveying this sense of longing and desire for an unattainable dream. In the song Dreams by Fleetwood Mac, we also get this push and pull between 2 chords, which represents a feeling of unfulfilled desire. In this case, someone left in suspension after a lover has gone away. The lyrics,
"Now here I go again, like a heartbeat drives you mad,"
are mirroring the idea of this repetitive loop representing a vision or dream going nowhere. Hook Theory categorizes these chords as the 6 and 7 chords because Dreams is in a minor key, but if it were in a major key, they would be the 4 and 5 chords. In Hadestown, the songs Epic 1, Epic 2, and Epic 3 are all built around a similar chord progression, vacillating between two chords, sort of like a 4 and a 5 chord, which evoke a similar longing for an idyllic past. However, there is a further twist in the Hadestown progression, one that is so interesting that I will have to explore it in a future video, so please subscribe for that. Now, these 4 to 5 progressions that I've just discussed in Teenage Dream, Dreams, and Epic 1, 2, 3 are similar to the way the chords in Heart of Stone work, but there's a slight difference. She is not weightless. Instead, she is like a stone, full of mass and weight and gravity, which is another word for seriousness and authority, and you can hear that in Jane's chord progression. Unlike the breezy Teenage Dream, Heart of Stone's chorus does not avoid the 1 chord, but instead we go from 4
You can build me up,
to 6
you can tear me down,
to 1
you can try but I'm
to 5.
unbreakable.
That's right, the 1 chord is right there. So how is this a shift in gravity? It's because the resolution we expect is thwarted. 5 doesn't resolve to 1, but goes to 4, and the 1 chord becomes a mere satellite in orbit around Jane Seymour's love. Instead of being arranged around a standard 5 to 1 resolution, the main organizing principle of this chord progression is the third leap up in the bass. The third leap up is essentially just a fancy way of saying the bass skips a note going up to the next chord. Because if you count the current note as 1, then skipping a note would be 1, 2, 3, hence a third. I previously talked about the meaning of the third leaps up in my video about the My Shot chord progression from Hamilton. There it also represents a striving for something more, which is very similar to how it's being used in Heart of Stone, which we shall soon see. Now before I break it down, let's hear how this bass line works in relationship to the melody.
You can build me up, you can tear me down, you can try but I'm unbreakable.
Going from the 4 chord to the 6 chord means going up from A, skipping B, to C sharp minor, which is a third above. Then the 6 chord goes to the 1 chord, skipping D sharp, and going straight to E. This progression even spells out the notes in the 4 chord, A, C sharp, and E, further cementing the 4 chord as the center of gravity. The last chord goes back to the 5 chord, breaking this pattern of upward third leaps as it tries to return the 1 chord to our musical center of gravity, but fails and instead returns us back to the 4 chord. And here is that entire sequence again.
You can build me up, you can tear me down, you can try but I'm unbreakable.
And now the stage is set for something remarkable. In one of the most profound moments in the song, Jane takes away the power of that 5 chord. How does she do that? Well, remember when I said the 5 chord has to forcefully assert itself to break the pattern of this chord progression? In the bridge, right before the anticipated climax of the song, we get another instance of the 5 chord forcefully asserting itself, building toward a big arrival point that we expect will land on the 1 chord. The tension grows and grows, and the home chord feels closer and closer and closer until the big anticipated arrival on the 1 chord never comes, and instead we get the softest and simplest 4 chord, establishing that Jane has in fact become the center of gravity in the song. But instead of heading straight into the climax, Marlow and Moss give us a mysterious silence with these sparse piano chords and no singing.
I think that is the point of no return for Jane. If I were to envision what's happening, those blah, 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 the silence before the big climax is when Henry leaves with Edward. He's gone. I've just said my final goodbyes. That moment where there's nothing going on besides that piano is me saying like goodbye before letting the dam burst and letting myself. Do you ever have those feelings where you hold it together, you save face as much as possible while somebody's there, and then the second you walk into an apartment, you close the door or something, you just let it, it collapses around you type of thing. That's kind of how I feel in that moment, while also still trying to hold it together and empower myself at the same time.
Indeed, what comes next after this quiet moment of just simple piano chords is an explosion into the climax of the song, where Jane repeats her affirmation of self-empowerment. And it's at this point, her chord progression comes back with a vengeance. And by vengeance, I mean this instance of the chord progression is deliberately undermining the power of the 5 chord, and it all has to do with those quiet chords right before the climax. See, the climax actually feels climactic because a key change has occurred. Now, this key change actually reinterprets the chord that came right before it. And what was the chord that came right before it? The 5 chord in suspension. A suspended 5 chord basically is a 5 chord that has one note that our ear is anticipating will resolve to give us a true 5 chord. But here Marlow and Moss use the suspended 5 chord in combination with the key change so that when the suspended 5 chord resolves, the resolved chord actually becomes the 4 chord in the new key center. This key change one step up means that the entire numbering system is shifted by 1, and what was once the 5 chord in the old key is now the 4 chord. And here's what the key change sounds like, and pay attention to how the chord actually hasn't changed, except we hear the 5 chord as the 4 chord in the new key. In case you couldn't hear that it's the same chord, here it is with strings. The key change takes this chord that once served an adversarial function and flips it into an ally. What this means is that here in the song's biggest moment, the 4 chord reigns supreme. In other words, Jane has completely wiped away the 5 chord's importance and thus the king's importance, and we are left with Jane's gravitational pull taking over. In fact, Jane's gravitational pull is so great, the chord progression changes in the final bars of the song to get rid of the 5 chord entirely. This change is so profound and yet so subtle that I even surprised Jasmine when I demonstrated how the chord progression changes in the climactic ending of the song. The chords actually change at the end. I don't know if you're...
No.
No? Okay.
No, tell me more.
I could just play it for you a little bit. Right? Like, so that's like the normal chord progression, but then for the last page or whatever, they're like, you can hurry up, tear me down.
Can't break me. Oh!
That's a chord that wasn't there before. So...
Whoa, Howard! Whoa! Hold up! You're rocking my world!
This is what my channel's all about.
Wow, okay, awesome. Cool. Go off, Howard. Go off.
All right, Jasmine, here I go. The reason for this change in the chord progression is to demonstrate just how huge Jane's gravity has become. A musical metaphor for the way her body itself became powerful through an increase in mass, her pregnancy. See, this chord progression is a series of leaps up by a third until the 5 chord would disrupt the pattern and attempt to restore the 1 chord, or the king, as the center of gravity. But in the final version of this chord progression, when Jane breaks away from the king's gravity and continues going up, and this time we get not the 5 chord but the 2 chord, which represents the fulfillment of the purest version of Jane's chord progression, because that 2 chord is a third below the 4 chord, completing the circle of these upward third leaps that represent her ascent to the status larger than even a king, pushing the king aside to assert her own worth that doesn't depend on him or anyone else.
It's no longer a conversation with her and Henry. It's a conversation for herself. It's almost like she's looking in a mirror, hyping herself up.
But sadly, her gravity does not last. She dies a mere 12 days after giving birth to Edward, and along with her dream of love with Henry VIII. Or does it? And that's when you realize it was there all along, that Heart of Stone was not just a metaphor for her love, it's an actual real thing. Before Henry VIII died, he requested to be buried with Jane Seymour.
It is my desire to be buried next to the body of my true and loving wife, Queen Jane Seymour.
So in a real sense, Jane does have a heart of stone, with the love that is engraved forever into her gravestone. Mirroring Jane's tragic ending, the end of the song brings back the 5 chord, which then brings us back to the home chord as we expect, but with a twist.
My heart of stone.
The home chord here is not the full 3-note triad as we expect from a solid, stable home chord. It is in fact missing a note. It's missing the center note, leaving a gaping hole where Jane Seymour once was the center of gravity. If you like learning more about this type of musical analysis, I recommend checking out this video sponsor, Hook Theory. Hook Theory is an educational platform designed to make music theory accessible and practical for everyone. It features tons of resources powered by their database of over 50,000 chord and melody analyses for popular songs you know and love. It graphically showed me a representation of the different parts of the song. You get representations of the melody, the chords underneath, a grid so that you can see the rhythm, and a keyboard which will illustrate how to play the melody or the chords note by note for yourself, and an option to switch to guitar if you want to learn how to strum it. But aside from this amazing database, they also have a fun ear training game called Chord Crush and Hook Pad, a songwriting sketchpad with a built-in music theory engine that makes smart suggestions in real time, so you can always find the next best note or chord for your new song. Hook Theory is great whether you're a seasoned musician or a beginner. And even if all of this still looks unapproachable, Hook Theory has you covered with its books feature that teaches you music theory lessons from basic to advanced concepts. And if you go to hooktheory.com/HowardHo, you can enjoy 20% off the Hook Theory Skills Bundle or your first year of Chord Crush Premium at the link in the description. Go to hooktheory.com/HowardHo for 20% off. Thanks for watching the video. Please subscribe for more musical analyses. I'd also like to thank my patrons on Patreon, including my newest patron, Nancy Huang. I'd also like to thank my special guest, Jasmine Forsberg, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.